The following program is brought to you by Caltech.
Good evening. I'm Jonathan Katz. I'm the Division Chair for the Humanities and Social Sciences, and it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. But since I have a captive audience, my first job is actually to tell you about the next Watson Lecture, which will be on January 13th, and quite a change of pace from this evening. It'll be Harvey Newman, Professor of Physics, who'll be talking on physics at the Large Hadron Collider, a new window on matter, space, time, and the universe. I'm sure it'll be a very interesting lecture. I know Harvey quite well. So tonight's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Jean-Laurent Rosenthal, who's a very distinguished economic historian. Tonight he's going to be speaking on Remembrance of Financial Crises Past. He's been studying historical crises for some time, fiscal crises for some time, and he promised he had no inside information on the current one. I wish he had told me if he did. What he's going to argue, and he's in some great detail, is the use of history in understanding and shaping our response to the current crisis. Although Jean-Laurent's only been on the faculty for a relatively brief time, he came to the faculty in 2006. He has a long history with Caltech. He actually was a Caltech PhD student back in the early 90s. Quite a successful one. He was actually, to my knowledge, the first and only Caltech social science PhD student to win the Clauser Prize, which is the prize we give annually across the entire institute to the best dissertation, the opening is the Clauser Prize is given to reflect extraordinary standards of quality, innovative research, ingenuity, and especially the potential of opening new avenues of human thought and endeavor. Maybe they were forecasting the role of economic history to understand current financial crises. After finishing up at Caltech, he moved just down the street to UCLA, where he was on the faculty for 17 years. And then we saw the light and recruited him back. He's now the Rhea A. and Leah G. Axline Professor of Business Economics. And more importantly for me, as a division chair, he's the executive officer for the social sciences, which means besides being an incredible scholar, he actually helps make the division run very well. So my great pleasure to introduce Jean-Laurent. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for coming tonight. Feels a bit like teaching intermediate microeconomics at UCLA, but this is a Watson lecture. And it's a Watson lecture about financial crises, and I think that all of us here are well aware that in the last 2 years, the United States has experienced its worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. The crisis arose, I will argue, and I hope to convince you tonight, because we've ignored some key lessons of history in the design of our financial markets. And when I say we, I mean all of us, because both during the boom and during the bust, all of it has occurred in plain sight. It's not the result of some rogue bureaucrat muddying the accounts or some venal banker twisting the accounts of mortgage balance sheets or something like that. All of it was available. There were lots of opportunities to stop this. So to begin crisis, we know a crisis when we see one. And so here are some crises in a different history. This is the history of mortgages in Paris, a place I've studied for quite some time. And this is part of a book we wrote a decade ago with Phil Hoffman, who's a professor of social science and history at Caltech, and Jean Poussalvinet, who's a professor at the École des Études in Paris. And you'll see a first crisis here in the 1720s, then a recovery and a boom in mortgages followed by a collapse, then a recovery, then another crisis, then a recovery, then another crisis, finally, final recovery. We'll come back to that last recovery at the end. I want to think about this crisis as the result of the French Revolution. This is not the kind of crisis we've experienced. This was actually associated with the government printing massive amounts of money, people being able to pay off their mortgages at very low prices, which doesn't seem to be what's going on today. At least I don't think. So there are many kinds of crises. I want to talk about financial crisis, a situation in which contracts are broken because someone does not or cannot pay, whether you're the real estate arm of a small city-state in the Middle East, whether you're a farmer in the Midwest, or whether you're a homeowner in Alhambra. These contracts are broken because people can't pay. In our crisis, it's about borrowers not paying their mortgages, and banks not paying depositors, and the people who have actually lent them money to make loans themselves. The crisis, I will show you, essentially has a sort of back and forth between real estate prices and mortgages, and then when real estate prices started to fall a couple years ago, we went from real estate prices to mortgage delinquencies to bad bank balance sheets, from bad bank balance sheets to bad share prices, and from bad share prices to a decline in government revenues. You've seen this in California, and more recently to a very rapid rise in unemployment. So what does our crisis look like? Well, here it is in the mortgage market. So if we look at the bottom line down here, this is the rate of foreclosure since the 1970s. Again, this is all data you can get off the web. It's actually true. I didn't make it up. And you'll notice that until 2005, the foreclosure rate bumps around 1%, maybe 1.5%, but it doesn't get very high. And then there's this. That's the crisis. You can look at the delinquency rate, which is the fraction of mortgages which are not in foreclosure, but where the last month of the mortgage hasn't been paid. And although there's a rise in the 70s as the economy gets sour, you could think about this as running, the scale is over here, it's obscured, between 5 and 6% for a long time. And then the crisis hits, and we've moved up to almost 10%. How did that happen? Well, you can go back to what's happened to the value of mortgage debt outstanding. Okay, went from where 1980 is 100, from about 100 for some time in the 70s and 80s to 400 at peak. It has now started to fall. So this is the beginning of the resolution of the crisis. We've got a long way to go. I'll show you. And then here's what's happening to real estate prices. They're rising at the same time. This is the joint creation of this real estate bubble and this problem of too many mortgages out there, and real estate prices have fallen. But if the question is, how far should they have to fall to get us back into some equilibrium? Don't worry, they don't have to fall back to 100. It's not that bad. So tonight what I want to do is explore this crisis as economic history. And that means that we're not going to be interested in some sets of questions like, what kind of actions should we take to mitigate unemployment in the next 6 months? Very important question. It's just not mine. I don't know anything about this. Economic history is utterly irrelevant for that. The world of unemployment today is fundamentally different from unemployment in the 70s or the 1870s or the 1770s. Economic historians have no expertise. There has been a lot of debate about who's responsible for the crisis. Is it Ben Bernanke or Alan Greenspan? We can talk about that. I view that as something to leave to the historians of the Federal Reserve in some future date. We don't have enough information about that, but it's not my problem. What I'm going to be interested in is the crisis origins and its long-term consequences. I want to ask questions like, is this crisis new? Have there been crises like this before? Because if it's new, well, maybe we didn't understand that, right? You could think there's never been a hurricane like Katrina, so the fact that half of New Orleans is underwater, well, we couldn't do anything about it because we didn't know. Or maybe there were hurricanes like Katrina, right? If this crisis is not so new, why did we not avoid it? And what can we do to prevent its recurrence? Because future prosperity in the US depends on us not having these kinds of crises very often. If you look at poor countries, they have lots of these crises, okay? And I won't give you any list because some of us were actually not necessarily born in this country and we don't want to say anything about that. So let's start with mortgages. Let's start with mortgages. And what I'm going to argue actually is that if you look at mortgages, which are collateralized debt obligations, so I pledge my house in order to get a loan, it is all about leverage, okay? And since we're at an institute of technology, leverage is something we understand because as freshmen, we were taught something about this by the Greeks. Give me a place to stand, and with a lever, I will move the whole world. Well, this also works in finance. Debt is the lever of finance. Why is it that I want to borrow for a mortgage? So I can afford more than 20% of my house, a room and a half, right? Why is it that I want to borrow as a business person so that I can grow my business faster? Why is it that a bank wants to borrow so it can make more loans? Debt is a lever of finance. And leverage is the ratio of debt to assets. So the traditional conforming loans were 80% of the value of the home. Leverage ratio 0.8 to 1. Commercial banks have traditionally had reserve requirements that lead them to have a leverage ratio of 10 to 1. So if you're a homeowner, don't expect to be a bank. Interestingly enough, investment banks in 2007, Bear Stearns, leverage ratio of 60 to 1. So think about how much the value of Bear Stearns' portfolio has to fall before there's a solvency problem. It can't pay. Not a lot. So they better be doing things very right, very often. And so one other way to think about it is give me enough leverage and I will give you a global financial crisis. It's not very difficult. Now, a big crisis starts with a big market. So don't give me credit cards. I don't care about credit cards. I care about two things in the history of the United States. So this is the distribution, the structure of the US debt market by debt category. And I hope you're seeing that there are two colors that matter. And I hope we're seeing the same colors, blue and red. So blue is the US national debt. And at the end of World War II, the US national debt accounted for 70% of all the outstanding debts in the United States. We'd fought the war by largely borrowing our way through it. And we won. And then we engaged in a process where the value of outstanding debts by the US was declining steadily through the mid-1970s. Then we had a bit of a rise, then we had a bit of decline. But this is a big market. And if the US government decided to behave a little bit like the French government in the 1720s, we might have a bit of an economic crisis. The other big market is this red stuff. It's mortgages. This is a unique characteristic of the United States, where this market is either the largest or the second largest. This debt category is either the largest or the second largest in the US. If the mortgage market gets sick for some reason, there's going to be an issue. You can't let this thing go wrong and not expect other things to happen. Here's consumer credit. So, people are complaining about the likelihood that credit cards are going to cause a problem. Yeah, but it's going to have to be a really big problem before it's going to have any effect of the kind that's over here. Okay? You may say, oh, look at these corporate and foreign bonds. Well, these are really two categories that for some reason the Federal Reserve decides are the same thing. From my perspective, they're not, but that's just the way the Federal Reserve does its accounting. So this is not new. If we had the data from the 19th century, you would again find in the 19th century the US had not much of a national debt, and Andrew Jackson actually paid it off. We've always had a lot of mortgages, so mortgages have been important. So if you look at finance and growth, so we don't actually have very good data on the value of outstanding mortgages before the 1920s. A lot of this has to do with the creation of regulatory institutions that force banks to report balance sheets, and in particular for mortgages, savings and loans and buildings and loans in the period before the 1970s. So if you look at this, the yellow line here is GDP. This is the size of the US economy. The red line is the value of outstanding mortgages. And I just want to suggest that if you look at this, there's a sort of regularity here that something strange seems to happen right here. That's our crisis. Something happened to change this historical relationship that as a society as a whole made it easy for us to carry our mortgages and then difficult. Now there are two other odd periods. There's the Great Depression where the economy falls. The stock of mortgages doesn't change very much. And then there's a period during World War II right here where the economy is actually growing, but the government's not allowing you to borrow to buy a house because it wants you to buy US bonds. And if you remember our previous picture, you're buying US bonds. Okay? So this is not ideal. I couldn't find a series for US national wealth that I could track on this, but there's a relationship between wealth and income. And so as this series, the ratio of these two series is giving you an idea about leverage. And what's going on here is we're increasing our leverage. We're increasing the size of mortgages outstanding relative to our wealth. Okay? How did that happen? How did that happen? There were a variety of innovations, and this is another point that I want to emphasize. Don't go back and think about any particular innovation that occurred over the last decade and a half as responsible for the financial crisis. You can take any one of these things away, the crisis would have still happened, and if you only had that one innovation, the crisis never would have occurred. So if you'd had subprime loans alone, subprime loans were 10% of the total market. If that was the only thing that was going on, and I'll show you why that can't possibly be the explanation, that wouldn't have been enough. What did we do? We engineered a whole variety of strategies, both by business and by government. Government let business do it, and in certain cases, government actually led the process to lower the cost of loans. Okay? One example of this is after 9/11, the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates, both to ease the pain of what happened in New York and Washington, but also to ease the pain of the dot-com bubble. And we did not have much of a recession in 2001 and 2002. But in 2003, we did not increase interest rates very much. We continued with a policy of easy credit. That's a government policy that lowers the cost of credit. There were innovations of the private market, in particular by institutions like Countrywide, but not only Countrywide, but also other traditional banks, that increasingly funded their mortgage portfolios by moving to the money market. Okay? Money market had very low interest rates, partially because of Federal Reserve policies. And it became very attractive for firms to borrow at short-term interest rates that were low and make mortgage loans that were carrying substantially higher interest rates. So how do you actually generate borrowers to want to do this? Well, you can't do something about interest rates because that's touching your profits. So you could start moving into allowing them to have smaller and smaller down payments. That's reducing the cost of getting into real estate. You can accept borrowers with less than perfect credit scores and other kinds of things that are making it easier for people to get access to loans. What you're doing in doing this is you're increasing the demand for real estate. And so real estate prices should be going up. That's my one comment about intermediate microeconomics. So here back, this yellow line is the value of outstanding mortgages in the United States over a shorter period. And then the green line is the value of homes as the Federal Housing Authority thinks of it, where again, if I remember, 1980 is 100. And what you'll note is this thing seems to not show much of a bubble. There's a relatively steady increase. There's a bit of an acceleration after 2000. Then there's a downturn more recently. Now the FHA only looks at loans, at home prices for loans that it might carry, and essentially it omits all the relatively expensive real estate. The other source that we have that's relatively long is the Case-Shiller Home Price Index for 10 cities, the 10 largest cities in the US. That's the blue line. It includes the really expensive real estate, and you could see the acceleration of prices exactly at the same time as the value of mortgages. That one peaks a little earlier, has a decline, and then if you're really optimistic, it stabilizes recently. But I wouldn't put too much effort on this. Now notice, we have no prices for highly valuable real estate before the mid-1980s. We have no history. We don't know what happened before. That's odd, isn't it? I mean, this is stuff that's been, houses have been around for hundreds of years. We don't know. But it makes it difficult to figure out whether things are right or wrong if you don't have the facts. Okay, so one of the important things that I want to emphasize here is if you're interested in understanding how to develop things, you better have long-run time series, in particular if you're worried about these kinds of issues. So that would get you to the set of kind of home prices and mortgage levels that you might see in 2003 and 2004. But that's not enough, because we have to keep going. So we're going to generate mortgage-backed securities. Again, on their own, not a problem. I'll show you evidence that you can do mortgage-backed securities. They're great. But you can do mortgage-backed securities plus subprime mortgages, then you're going to run into a problem. How do you do that? You have to separate out the risky part of the mortgage portfolio from the unrisky part. You have to create tranches. So some people will buy the safe part of the portfolio, and some people part of the risky part. Well, that's fine, but then intervenes bank regulation that allows banks to hold the safe part of these mortgage-backed securities as part of their reserves, provided they get insurance. And there's another regulation that says, well, that insurance can be provided without reserve by the insurance company if that insurance company has AAA rating. That insurance company is called AIG. It holds an enormous amount of, it is the counterparty to an enormous amounts of these contracts in the US and to $300 billion of bonds in Europe. And it has no collateral for this stuff. So when its rating is going to go down, problems are going to arise. We'll come back to why people allowed this to happen, but I want to emphasize these are regulations. These regulations allowed AIG to become more highly leveraged. As one of my friends who now works for Bank of America told me, this was all about getting 0.25% interest more for us and 0.25% more for AIG. Now, the 0.25% for AIG on its several $100 billion of bonds was free. It had nothing backing those contracts. They never were going to matter. Okay? We know that's not true, but that was the attitude. And I'll come back to why that could happen. So innovation led, as you can see here, to a rapid growth in the value of homes and a rapid rise in the value of real estate. And the asset boom has a particular pattern that I want to come back to. Think about real estate as always having a frontier. The frontier, you could see it in San Diego on the port where they built new townhouses in very nice apartments. You could see it in Nevada. It's called Las Vegas. There are periods and times in the past where the frontier was at some other location. And this time, the asset boom was particularly severe on what I call the crabgrass frontier: California, Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, Florida. There's a state missing. I hope you have an idea. It was more severe in big cities because people rediscovered the value of living in big cities. Suburbs were not quite as attractive everywhere because they were location rents. Nobody wants to fight the traffic in Los Angeles. So people want to live where someplace is desirable. There's only so many houses there. But it spreads pretty much everywhere. It's quite remarkable if you look at the Case-Shiller data is actually published city by city, and it's quite remarkable how, although the patterns are slightly different, this process is occurring everywhere. Texas has been spared the crash, not because it did any better in this dimension, it's just because there's this thing called the price of oil that's gone from $37 a barrel to $150 a barrel precisely at the moment that the thing breaks. So their economy is doing well. That's, my view is, you know, Texans are lucky. I don't know. So who to blame? So that'll be my one slide where I hope we can actually get rid of this problem. So the liberalization was actually, to a large extent, started under an administration that was Democratic by Bill Clinton. And there was this guy who was the head of the Fed called Alan Greenspan that had been nominated by a Republican. Then there was the first Secretary of Treasury, Larry Rubin, and then another guy who's still around, Larry Summers. Okay. Then this lasts for a while, and then the Bush administration comes in. They have the same federal chair of the Federal Reserve, and then they get a new one. They have 3 Secretaries of the Treasuries. None of these people ever thought there was much of a problem. Larry Rubin at one point said, well, you know, we kind of got it wrong. But don't blame the Democrats, don't blame the Republicans, because you have to blame, to some extent, American society as a whole. We are all responsible in this. Why? Because the reason why these people didn't do anything is because politicians just do what you want them to do. The cost of political intervention in this were really high. I mean, go back to this picture. This is not a surprise. Everybody sees this, so they know there's something going on. Everybody is seeing these pictures as they're happening. Why were the cost of political intervention high? Because homeowners are seeing these very rapid price appreciation. They're feeling wealthy. If you start raising the cost of capital to mortgages, home prices are going to decline. How am I going to get my home equity line? And as one of the people I said I had dinner with suggested, how am I going to go to Hawaii? By taking money out of my house. The construction industry loved it. We had the longest construction boom since the end of World War II, when we had a very big one. The real estate industry loved it because there was an enormous amount of turnover in housing, and at 4 to 6% commission on every piece of real estate, these are good days. Even though real estate experts, when we talked to them, said this looks kind of strange. The financial industry loved it, not only because all these new homes that were being sold were carrying mortgages, but also because as interest rates fell, lots of us refinanced. And as housing prices Rows, people refinanced to redo their kitchens or whatever else. All of that was generating fees for these people. Would-be homeowners, that one's a little hard. Prices are going up, but the value of mortgages is going, the cost of getting a mortgage is going down because the down payment you have to put in is less. And you're balancing these two things. And if you talk to people, people thought this was actually good because they were able to get into housing earlier, sooner. And of course, there are the people that, as economists, we love, speculators in real estate, because they were being offered a chance to bet on the price of a house for 5% of the value of the house. And for 5%, bear in mind a 15% appreciation triples your return. It's a 300% return in a year. So we all ate cake. We all let this happen. And now we're going to have to deal with it. So you can blame one side or the other on this. You can blame all of them. But you have to bear in mind of all of these groups, we're pushing against any change or any intervention. Okay? The crash has been very severe. You've seen delinquency and foreclosures triple. You've seen 3 of the largest mortgage lenders collapse countrywide, WAMU and Wachovia. And if I remember, at the corner of, it's not Colorado and Lake, I think it's one street up, maybe it's Wallen and Lake. Each one of these had a corner, and they're all gone. Oh, I forgot, there was IndyMac, which was a Pasadena institution, but that wasn't so big as these guys, so I wasn't going to count it. Bank stocks fell by 90% from peak to trough, like Citibank or Bank of America. These are not small institutions. That's a pretty severe crash. The stock market as a whole fell by 50%. Dow Jones was at 14,000 and some, and was, it didn't get down to 7,000, but very close to. Real estate prices have fallen by 30% or more in many parts of the United States. That's a crash. And once that happens, people start talking about the Great Depression. History comes back. But if history comes back here, I don't understand why it wasn't there before, but that's just because I'm an economic historian, I always want to push that we should actually sort of think about things in the long run. So before the crash, in fact, the arguments that were made was that history didn't matter. Okay? That, in fact, it was great because, those of us who lived through the dot-com boom, it was a new economy. We could have low interest rates, low unemployment, and no inflation. It was a new economy. Well, this was a new economy of 2 different ways. One is that innovation had made higher leverage possible without additional risk. One argument was that bank concentration and the unification of banks, which was something that took over 150 years to achieve in the United States, was allowing banks to be diversified because they were in multiple markets. And as Alan Greenspan famously said, housing markets in the United States do not all move in the same direction. If it goes down in California, it'll go up in New York. Yeah, right. Sometimes that's true, sometimes that's not, and we actually care a lot about the cases when all the markets will move in the same direction. The second issue, and this I have to say that as a professional economist, I do have to say we got something wrong. If you think about the construction of financial portfolios, what you're trying to do by having multiple things in your portfolio is to reduce risk. So you're trying to find assets that are behaving differently over time. So you'd like to have some stocks that have some volatility, and then you'd like to have some other stocks that move in another direction. So you'd like to have some things that go up when the price of oil goes up, and you have to have some things that go down when the price of oil goes up. So this to sort of even things out. That's a very simple idea. What we were involved in and have been involved in as economists is designing financial instruments that produce this kind of these kinds of negative correlations artificially. That was the whole idea between slicing up portfolios of mortgages. And in the short run, we'd never done this before, the correlations were either zero, they moved all in sort of random directions, or they actually moved off in opposite directions. Okay? And so, but people had no history for these assets, they were new. And we treated very short-run data as though that was actually all the data we needed. The problem is that periodically all these asset prices will move in the same direction and they'll move down. Okay? The problem for that is, remember, when you have debt, you have to pay on your debt or you will be insolvent. So since the crash, history has come back. Excuses made by people like Alan Greenspan is this is a once-in-a-century crisis. Couldn't see it coming. Well, we've been a democracy for a couple hundred years, so presumably once in a century we should at least have 2 examples of this. Baron Bernanke, professor of macroeconomics. Now, we don't teach macroeconomics at Caltech. I now know why. Christina Romer, professor of macroeconomics at Berkeley, this is Princeton, have derived part of the legitimacy, he as the head of the Federal Reserve, Christina Romer as the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, from their expertise in the Great Depression. They are scholars of the Great Depression. And I hope this is very valuable for understanding how to get out of this. But is that the right history to understand the cause of the crisis or even what's going to happen? And I'm going to make a claim that no. Because 1929 is a crisis that has a very particular path. It goes from equities, there was a stock market crash on, I think, a Black Friday, to banks. Banks had lent money to people speculating in shares, in equities. So banks then needed money back. They called in mortgages. The mortgages that were outstanding in 1929 were almost exclusively 5 years balloon payment mortgages. That was a standard instrument. So all the people who in 1929 had borrowed in 1924, their mortgages came due and the bank said, give us our money back. So guess what happened to real estate prices? They all sold and the real estate prices started to fall. Okay? That's not the change for 2007, 2008, or 2009. This is not our crisis. And so if you're going to draw lessons from this, be careful. Okay? So what economic historians like to do is to put these crises in historical perspective, and we're going to start with this recent crisis. And we're going to exploit this relatively steady relationship between this red line that used to be orange back then, but now it's gotten worse, so it's become red, and the yellow line, which is the GDP, to remove the acceleration, because you see there's an inflection here where something odd happens. And what you can do is simply say, well, what would happen if the old historical relationship had been maintained? And that's that small piece of green line here. Notice there's a relatively large difference between the green line and that red line. That's the difference between in the value of mortgages had we not had this expansion. Okay? And what would have happened? Well, one way to think about it is the result of the expansion is that mortgages were worth 65% of GDP in the 80s and early 90s. They were going to peak out at 105. 105% of GDP is over it's $14.7 trillion in today's dollars and about $7 trillion in 1980 dollars. So there's been inflation stuff like that, so you have to make these real. And so the difference between 5 and 7 is like the difference between 14.7 trillion and $10 trillion. We have $4.7 trillion of mortgages we don't want. Now, if you think we're going to get rid of that problem in the next 6 months, you're really optimistic. And I have some mortgages to sell to you. Okay? So that's in some sense the lesson here is we have this very large, what economists might call debt overhang. We have way more mortgages than we need. Now, it's not that I can actually go and find a third of the mortgages and say to these people, well, you should not be homeowners, because a lot of people who are homeowners owe more than they should. Okay? So it's not so much that that there's a specific group of people who have mortgages that they shouldn't have, is that most of us are very highly leveraged. Having bought a home 18 months ago, I'm part of this category. But every time I think about this, my colleagues at Caltech tell me that I'm a Caltech professor and I should pay my mortgage. So I will, I promise. So beyond the recent past, so we could go back and look at things that have happened in particular in the Great Depression, and there's another crisis, you see it right here in the 1980s, the savings and loan crisis. Now those are not exactly crises that are ideal. The savings and loan crisis is provoked by inflation. Okay, it's the way we were actually trying to deal with the aftershocks of Vietnam is we actually had high rates of inflation. And savings and loans were issuing fixed rate mortgages which were losing their value steadily as inflation was accelerating, and they were paying depositors 1 or 2%. So clearly, if you were not going to be very happy putting your money in a savings and loan, so they had no money to fund the mortgages, and they had these large mortgages that weren't very valuable, that was a problem. It was a crisis. We spent, if I remember, $500 billion getting out of that one. So remember, 4.7 trillion, $500 billion. We've grown up in the economy. So, but again, I want to say this one's not very useful for understanding that one, because this one is going from inflation to a problem in the mortgage market and not the reverse. What about the Great Depression? It's not great because, as I said, it moves from equities to credit to real estate. Neither the real estate sector nor the mortgage market can take the blame for the Great Depression. There was some excessive building in certain suburbs of large cities because this was essentially 20 years after automobiles became available and people started moving out to suburbs. But that's actually small as a particular trigger. But it does have this familiar pattern. It's bigger on the frontier and in suburbs. Okay? So what do you do if we want to actually understand this? Well, one way to think about this is the bigger and the less frequent the problem, the more history you have to encompass. You have to be willing to go back in time, or you have to be willing to go somewhere else than in the US. Because we're only one history. And I'm going to start with two episodes in the 19th century, one in the 1830s and one in the 1890s. Both feature land booms and mortgage credit expansion followed by a crisis. And they have each slightly different lessons. In each case, these problems began as regional problems, but in several ways they created larger problems in the US and abroad. There was, as a result of the crisis of the 1830s, a stock market crash in London and Paris in 1838. The only reason why I know that is because I happen to be a European economic historian, and I worry about this. Every now and then I have to remember some things come from the US. Okay, two episodes. So the first episode, by the way, there's an issue about wheat in mortgage crises in the 19th century. So these are the 13 original colonies along the eastern seaboard. Well, at the end of the American Revolution, the 13 original colonies cede all of the territory that is west of them to the federal government. So historically, the federal government has been the largest landowner in the United States, and it has only had one mission, I was told as a graduate student, to get rid of that land and put it into private hands. Okay? So where we're going to go to Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Minnesota. We could have gone to Kentucky and Tennessee, but that's in the South, and things happen a little differently there. And see what happens in the 1830s as settlers start moving there. So the first thing that happens is there's a land boom that's associated with the federal government making this land available in what is called the Old Northwest. But the federal government has this problem. How's it going to get rid of this land? So it decides to sell the land on credit. So it becomes a mortgage holder for settlers on the frontier. And the rationale for doing this is one that recurs today. It's to make the land available to as many people as possible. If you were a big speculator, you could buy a lot of it. If you were a settler, you could buy a small amount on credit. It's the ownership society in 1837. It's Andrew Jackson and Thomas Jefferson. Andrew Jackson, Thomas Jefferson's view of how things should happen. But the important part about this is because the settlers are coming in, they're picking up these parcels. The federal government's not particularly interested in controlling land prices. It's just trying to get this land into private hands and have it being put into use to use. Early settlers are very successful and land prices rise quickly. I'll show you that. More people want to come to Indiana, but people in Indiana realize that they can make money if they can provide infrastructures and allow these land prices to rise even more. So there's a reaction. The state of Indiana, it's only an example, most of the states in this area did this, and some of the states, like Pennsylvania, did this as well, decided that they could use the expected increases in land value to fund infrastructure improvement. Okay? Revenue bonds. We do this too in California, right? And in January 1836, the legislature of Indiana passes a huge bill to build 2 new canals, to extend the canal that already exists in Indiana, to build a new railroad, to survey more routes, to begin construction of railroads everywhere they could find it, to clear the one river in Indiana that's potentially navigable, and to create a bank to fund the commercialization of crops in Indiana. So what's going on in Indiana, remember, Indiana, if I remember, is this thing. They want to get out to the Great Lakes, which are up here, so they can ship their goods through the Great Lakes to the Erie Canal and then off to Europe. The wheat is not something they want to eat. They want to actually sell it to Europeans, okay? And so these canals are thought to be useful, bring more settlers, land value will rising, and in fact, investors in the bonds issued by the state of Indiana actually believe this, okay? So the state of Indiana has no trouble placing its bonds. So here's Indiana in 1834, not a lot of debt. Then this is all authorized by this one bill to build up infrastructure in Indiana, and it's authorized the data doesn't exist, but we have a pretty good idea land prices are already rising, so this inverted V shape is what happened to land prices. They went from $5 to $10 in just 2 years. This is even better than California. Okay? And notice they start to fall, but they're continuing to borrow. People view this as temporary. And then they continue to fall, and they fall below to what they were in 1835. And then they stabilize at this lower level. One reason is settlers are continuing to come to the frontier, so the production of wheat that's out for sale to world markets is increasing very rapidly. So the anticipated revenue from property taxes don't materialize. They were low at the beginning, then they started to rise a little bit, and then what does the state of Indiana do? It raises property tax rates. Maybe we should do that, but never mind. It still doesn't work because these property taxes are being raised at the same time as land prices are falling so fast that it just can't pay. And so in 1841, Indiana defaults, and it's one of 8 states that defaults. And we don't tend to talk about that history in the United States of insolvency by local governments. It's not just Orange County, by the way. 8 states. Okay? One of the consequences of this is once the crisis is over, Indiana will put in place balanced budget rules and pass a constitutional amendment prohibiting the state from owning a bank. Okay? We will never do that again. And we adopted a lot of these rules when we created our Constitution in California. Now, what were the consequences of this? Well, interestingly enough, neither the states that defaulted nor the federal government was concerned with investors. Why? Because there were 2 kinds of debt outstanding in places like Indiana. One were state bonds, and they were held by British investors. There's no reason to bother about British investors. So British investors, when Indiana defaulted, they suggested that the federal government should get involved and make Indiana pay, because Indiana, they thought about it like a county in England. And you know, the British government's powerful, it's going to make these guys pay. By the way, British counties pay. Okay? And the federal government says, but Indiana's sovereign. We can't make them pay. So, tough. Second thing is, there's a lot of mortgages held by the federal government, but there's also a lot of private mortgages in Indiana, and these are largely held by Easterners. People in Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania. Well, they don't reside in the state of Indiana, so they have no political clout. So states pass debt moratorium. It says you don't have to pay for 2 or 3 years until hopefully property values will recover. Okay? This is not stuff that is making the financial system work. In the end, the federal government will actually forego the debt that is owed by settlers because Andrew Jackson does something nobody else has ever dared to do. Anybody know what Andrew Jackson did to the national debt? He paid it off. What a weird man. Okay? So they didn't care about this revenue. They were getting a lot of revenue from the export taxes on imported goods at U.S. ports, and it didn't really care about the revenue, the foregone revenue from the land. So that was actually the kind of, help the mortgagees situation. And after 1837, this is when we get the Homestead Acts that allow settlers who go out to the frontier to essentially get land for free. Okay? Federal government gets out of this program. Now, you still have these state bonds out there in London that people aren't paying, and this creates an opportunity. An opportunity for a firm named Peabody & Co. And if you've been to museums in the East Coast, you will have encountered this name. There's a Peabody Museum at Harvard. There's a thing called the Hartford Athenaeum. Is that what it's called? Which was partially paid for by people who were members of this firm. And Peabody was from Baltimore, and so there are Peabody things in Baltimore. But Peabody doesn't live in Baltimore. He's an investment banker in London, and his profits came from selling these bonds on the London market. And he should have just gotten out when the going was good, but he decided not to. And after the defaults, Peabody comes back to the US and puts a lot of effort in negotiating resumption with different states' legislatures. So when that happens, the British say, he's a good guy. And he earns this reputation for carrying investment that gets transmitted to a successor firm, and you may have heard of the successor firm. He doesn't have any children. He sells the firm to a man named Junius Morgan, who happens to be J.P. Morgan's father. Which gets us to the next boom. So the boom we were in there is over here in these red and green shaded areas. This is a map of the US with population density. By the 1890s, the frontier is over here, places like Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, the Dakotas, Oklahoma. And this is wheat. So what has happened is in the areas that were growing wheat in the 1830s are now growing corn. This is what we know as the Corn Belt. And there's a new area with a slightly different kind of wheat that's being grown on the frontier. And again, you need to break up the prairie, you need to buy equipment and so forth. And these farmers that are going out there are going to need some capital. Okay? Oops. All right. So we're opening up the plains. Farmers need credit. Where are they going to get the credit? So they could go to savings or buildings and loans. What's amazing about America is we open banks before we actually build towns. So these things are there on the frontier really, really fast. And their loans are incredibly safe. Alan Bogue, who wrote a really fantastic book in the 1950s, claimed that total losses on capital never exceeded 0.25% of capital in any given years in local savings and loans on the frontier. I would love to see a bank today be able to match that performance. Okay? But there are problems with local savings and loans. They only lend within a given county. And they have limited funds because they only get deposits in that given county. And on the frontier, if you're a farmer, you don't want to put your money in savings and loans. You want to put it in more animals or more plows or more buildings. So they don't have a lot of money. They have very safe loans, but they don't make a lot. So how are we going to solve this problem? Well, you could ask Lance Davis, who only a few years ago was a professor at Caltech. This was a paper he wrote thinking of me when I was 3 years old, I think, because it gives you what was the solution. And people saw this immediately. In New England and the Mid-Atlantic, which were well-settled economies, interest rates were not very high, about 4 to 5%. I'll leave the South side. And then as you got to the Midwest and the Rockies and the Pacific, further out on the frontier, interest rates were much higher. The demand for capital was really high. So if you could take some money and borrow it about 5% here and lend it out at 9%, there was a lot of money to be made. Interregional capital flows would solve the problem. Now, to foreshadow, because I want to come back to this, look at interest rates in Europe. If you could get the money out of Europe, you're going to do really well. Okay? So that's how we're going to go about doing this. And we're going to see institutions that do that. But before we do that, I want to come back to J.P. Morgan, because one of the early ways in which J.P. Morgan hated his money, and his father wasn't so keen on this, was to underwrite bonds to fund mortgages in the Midwest using money collected by his father in London at those interest rates. But Morgan got out of this market before the crash. So he's a little bit like the Goldman Sachs of the 1890s. There's something about leading bankers and anticipating certain key events that I find astounding. So we're going to want to do this interregional issue, bring money from the East Coast and put it in Kansas, right? How to do that? People form companies that are called mortgage companies in the Midwest to act as brokers. The companies then hire loan agents who run around the countryside looking for farmers who would like to borrow some money. Okay? So they're like the people who 2 or 3 years ago were calling you up at night and saying, would you like a new mortgage? Or sending you these pieces of paper, except these people were actually traveling around. And if a farmer said yes, and the loan was actually funded, they got paid a commission. I think almost everybody at Countrywide was on this kind of a compensation scheme. And that means that they had an incentive to maximize the value of loans made. That's how they made their money. They got 5 to 6% of the value of every loan that was made. Okay? Not a fraction of the return on the loans. So if the loan was defaulted upon, it didn't matter to them. The capital comes from the East Coast of Europe. Now what's interesting in this early phase is the investors own the mortgages. So after you put all your application, it gets put into an envelope and it gets sent to somebody in Hartford or New York or Boston who opens the envelope and looks at this and says, do I want to put my money in there or not? Okay? So the investors, and most of the people who seem to have been involved in this market were relatively experienced, they can screen the loans. And they return some of them, which annoys the loan agents because they've put effort into putting this file together and it's not getting funded. Okay? But this system works and is quite profitable. Well, if there are profits to be made in economics, we know there will be other people who will try to imitate. We call that entry. New companies create competition, and they need loan agents. They need people who have this experience of finding these farmers who want to borrow some money. While the loan agents then see there's competition for their services, they decide they want to work for companies that don't turn down applications. Well, that makes sense, right? Because that reduces your effort relative to however much money you want to make. So the mortgage companies have to find sources of funds where they can control the acceptance rate, right? Not send the mortgage, the envelope with the mortgage to somebody on the East Coast and saying, do you want to actually lend money for this? They're going to be able to say, no, we commit. You're going to be pre-approved, right? Notice, this is the 1890s. This is 100 years before any of this stuff happened. And mortgage-backed bonds, mortgage-backed securities solve this problem. How? Well, because the mortgage company takes a bundle of mortgages, or actually, during the best part of the boom, promises to create a package of securities, and then gets $1 million in Europe, and then funds the mortgages later, okay? This is supposed to be advantageous to the investors for 3 different reasons. So most investors might have owned 5, 6, or 10, or 20 mortgages, and if they did well, they did well. If they did badly, they did well. When you get to buy mortgage-backed bonds, you're buying 10 or 15% of several hundred mortgages or 1,000 mortgages. So you're much more diversified relative to the default of any one of the individual farmers. The second thing is, these are relatively substantial amounts of money. So there's lots of these bonds, and so there's a market for them in Europe, so you can buy and sell them. Your investments are all of a sudden liquid, whereas those mortgages that they were looking at and deciding where they wanted to take, they were actually holding them to maturity. That's good. Liquidity is good. If you want to use your money for something else, you can sell the bonds. Okay? So for a variety of reasons, this is supposed to be desirable to the investors. But then, because of the lack of control of acceptance rates, lending standards decline, and there is a crisis. Of the 99 mortgage companies operating in 1890, 9 were still in business in 1897. This comes from work by Ken Snowden, who's an economic historian at UNC Greensboro. And the reason why this happens is systematically associated with the debenture loans. That is, those loans that were actually funded by these mortgage-backed bonds, where the mortgage companies could not control, committed to not control acceptance rates. What had they done in this story is they had traded off information quality, what loans to fund, for financial sophistication. And I'm going to claim that is a recipe for disaster. And that's exactly what we did, one of the things that we did in this last process. So we're going to quickly finish the tale of American crises and regulation. So interestingly enough, despite all of this, there's very little regulation in mortgage markets, no regulation by the federal government until the Great Depression. And the reason is these guys, these local savings and loans, remember, they're really, really safe. They're making some money. They don't want regulation, because if you had regulation, they're going to have to compete more severely with these out-of-state folks. And there are really powerful lobbies, tens of thousands of savings and loans in the United States. A lot of them are mutual, and their owners are quite well organized. During the Great Depression, one of the consequences of the Great Depression is a massive crisis in the mortgage market, and so we get an intervention by the federal government called the Federal Savings and Loans Deposit Insurance Corporation, FSLIC, but we leave a lot of the regulation of savings and loans to states. So we end up with this double regulation, which you will see again. Banks also faced crises in 1907. There's some new work in economics to suggest that this crisis is actually an aftershock of the San Francisco earthquake. And again in the 1930s, because of the Great Depression, we create 2 institutions to, one, the Federal Reserve after the 1907 crisis, and the FDIC after the Great Depression in 1933. So why did we create the Federal Reserve? We created the Federal Reserve because though J.P. Morgan saved the banking system in 1907, we didn't want to let him do it again. But that meant that we actually had to limit what we were going to do. And so neither the Federal Reserve nor the FDIC have authority over loans. They have authority over federally chartered commercial banks, of which there are about 7,000 in the 1920s, and there's about 25,000 state-chartered commercial banks, okay? So they don't have authority over investment banks because J.P. Morgan is an investment bank. What's left of the J.P. Morgan investment bank is Morgan Stanley. The state-chartered banks opposed by states, and other financial firms like insurance companies, which are major players in the financial system, again, regulated by states. But remember, the story of IAIG is all of these different institutions end up being interconnected. And that's going to turn out to matter. So what I want to emphasize here is our complex regulatory system of today is not something that was hatched today. It's the result of a complicated political history. It doesn't have anything to do with an efficient regulatory system. It's just something that's secreted from crisis to politics, back and forth. It has produced lots of good innovation and lots of bad innovation. Okay? In particular, innovation that leads people to be able to run away from regulators by creating things that are not banks, right? Non-bank mortgage companies. Okay? So, could we do this right? Yes. But we're going to have to leave the US. It's not that we do things wrong, it's just I have a much better example elsewhere. So we're going to go look at mortgage securities done right. It's common now to say, yes, we can, and I think we can. So we're going to go back to Paris. So this is the French Revolution. You saw this huge crisis and then crises. And you notice this mortgage market doesn't do very well. The population of Paris right around here is about 700,000 people. It's about 1.2 million here, so you'd expect to be more mortgages over here. And then you see this red stuff. We're going to talk about the institution that makes all those loans, which are half of all the loans by 1870. It's a bank called the Crédit Foncier. It no longer exists because there was a liberalization of the mortgage market in the 1980s in France, and it started doing interesting things and promptly failed. It was founded in 1852 as the Parisian and then French mortgage bank. It was the third of these attempts at creating a mortgage bank selling mortgage-backed securities in France after the French Revolution. The other two had failed. Now it turns out to be if you ever go to Paris and you look at buildings, you're looking at buildings funded by this institution. This is what Paris looked like before the Crédit Foncier got involved. Streets where you couldn't drive a car, very dirty. This is when they start rebuilding, they're actually clearing out a sort of plaza for a church. There used to be buildings going almost all the way up to the church. Then when they rebuild, they build these nice buildings on paved streets and a certain number of stories. This is a very fancy street in Paris. Just as 1911, there was actually a flood. But you can see already the kind of buildings they're building. They're quite tall. They have running water at every floor. And in fact, sometimes they have little signs saying there's actually natural gas at every floor. This is the end of the project. This is the Rue de Rivoli. So this is the main street from the Champs-Élysées to the town hall. And you can see these buildings, shops at the bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4 nice floors, and then garrets on top. And when you wander around Paris, that's all what you see because that's what the Crédit Foncier was interested in funding. How does it do this? Well, it's kind of an odd bank because it's privately owned, but it's government run. That is, the prime minister names the CEO. I never figured out why they did this, but that's the way they decided to do this. It's also odd in the sense that at this time, the typical mortgage in Paris is not very different from what you get on the frontier. It's a 7 to 8 year balloon payment fixed rate mortgage. The day this bank opens, it starts making 30 to 75 year self-amortizing fixed rate mortgages. Okay? So a loan it made in 1900 would have been finished paid off in 1975. It had a lot of confidence in the future. It funds these loans by issuing mortgage-backed securities, and both its stock and the bonds are traded on the Paris Bourse. And as I noted, it's very deeply involved in the reconstruction of Paris. Okay? So why, you might ask, does the Crédit Foncier not fail like the Western mortgage companies? It's doing the same thing. It's entering a market. It's using these new financial techniques. And why does it not fail? It doesn't fail because it learned from history. It learned that the prior firms, called the Crédit Territorial and the Banque Laffitte, had failed to overcome problems of asymmetric information. It was completely paranoid about the fact that capital markets are not so much about money, they're about information. It's about what you know, where you're putting your money. And the Crédit Foncier was well aware that it was dealing with a set of local, traditional intermediaries that were extremely well informed. And therefore, they were running the risk that the loans that they would be making would be made to lenders, to borrowers, that these traditional intermediaries didn't want. So they had to find a solution to this problem of making loans to people other people don't want. So how does it do that? Well, it decides to stay well away from marginal borrowers and find borrowers who are really safe. To do that, it requires extremely exacting collateral evaluation. This is exactly the kind of screening discussion we had with frontier mortgages, and strict loan-to-value ratios. How strict? It doesn't make loans beyond 50% of the value of the collateral. Okay? This means that loans are expensive, but they're cheaper for bigger loans and for larger parcels, in particular for doing the collateral evaluation. So that's going to remove anybody who wants a loan for a short amount of time and doesn't have highly valuable collateral, because you have to bear all these investigation costs before you get the loan. You could get turned down. Then in order to induce people to show up, it has to give borrowers something the market can't, and that's these long maturities and low interest rates. So what it's doing is it's selecting the safest borrowers. How do we know that? Well, I'm just going to give you the data for Paris. The data for the countryside is so striking, it's almost unbelievable. So since my children tell me that sometimes I make things up, I'll give you data that's believable. So in the 1850s, the Crédit Foncier makes loans that are about 40,000 francs. There's 5 francs to the dollar. So that's about $8,000. Per capita income is about 1,000 francs. So if you convert this to US dollars, the median loan made by the Crédit Foncier is about $4 million. Okay? Other intermediaries in Paris are making loans for 10,000 francs. So bear in mind, these are collateralized by Paris real estate. You don't own apartments at this time, you own entire buildings. Okay? Buildings are worth a lot of money. But then notice what happens to the median loan of the Crédit Foncier. It falls between 1858 and 1899, while the other loans are actually growing just simply because the economy is growing and people are becoming wealthier. So that the ratio between the two is moving from 4 to 1.7. What this is telling you is that in the initial period, the Crédit Foncier is only picking people who want really, really big loans, and they can investigate as much as it wants and get very, very good information about. And then over time, as it learns about the market, it starts going after, well, slightly less good borrowers, or actually borrowers that it's not going to investigate quite as effectively. Okay? The countryside, the Crédit Foncier decides it doesn't really have that kind of advantage. There are millions of loans made in the countryside. There are millions of borrowers that it would have to investigate. That's too difficult. Okay? So it essentially stays out of the countryside for a really long time and stays in urban real estate where it can actually do what it needs to do. Okay? How do you want to think about this? Does this matter? Well, you'd say, well, this can't be expanding credit because you're already giving money to people who already have it, just lowering the cost for rich people to get access to credit. But when we look at the data for all of France, what we find is, in fact, there's a substantial growth in the size of the mortgage market because the other intermediaries, when they lose these big clients, develop techniques to find other clients that wouldn't have been funded otherwise. Because they're well informed of these local conditions, they can afford to do that. Okay? So this is essentially pushing the traditional intermediaries to go out and expand the market. They're not doing it, somebody else is going to do it. Okay? So now we're going to wrap up. I want to come back to this point about it's all leverage. The lessons from the Crédit Foncier is simple. It's not whether or not to be leveraged, it's just how much. More leverage will give you more accelerated growth. So if you wanted to rebuild even more of Paris, you would have had to be able to lend money to people on less good conditions, but you would have had more crises. So the rules in the mortgage market that we should adopt should be very simple. Keep loans, and by loan, the loan, what I mean is the value of the first, the second, and the home equity, plus whatever other things you're going to collateralize with the piece of real estate to 85% of the home value. I don't care whether it's 85 or 90 or 80, but we should fix some number and keep it there. And then let the mortgage market deal with the attendant problem. It's easy to enforce because these things are very easily available, requires no institutional innovation. If we're going to go and say, well, we've got to regulate banks, the problem with banks is they're going to invent new things really fast to get around this. Right? So if you say, oh, you can't raise money this way, oh, they'll find some other way. That's how they make their money. So let's deal with ourselves. Let's bind ourselves. Okay? Now, the result of that, of course, is you'll be able to borrow less. So you may not all have granite countertops. You may not be able to drive convertibles or go to Hawaii as often as you want. But maybe we could all retire when planned. And I have a long way before I retire, but someday I might want to. And we should sort of get out of this thing that we inherited from Thomas Jefferson, who I'm kind of fond of, and Andrew Jackson that I'm even fonder of for some strange reason. It's okay to be renters. I was one until I was 35. Because in the late 1990s, if you wanted to get a reasonable loan, you had to put 20% down. And I survived that 10-year period working at UCLA in a rental apartment. It was fine. We can do it. We don't all have to own real estate. So recovery in the long run. So what I want to suggest is this is not over now. So the red line is up to this point here is real. That's data. That's the value of outstanding mortgages. The yellow line up to this point here is real also. It's the value of GDP. The blue line is just a value that mortgages attained at peak, all in $1980. The green line is what should have happened if we hadn't done this interesting experiment in financial innovation. And it's a little difficult to figure out how rapidly mortgages are going to decline, but this is my forecast. And that says that we won't return to what a reasonable trend is until about 2015 because we have to pay down our mortgages. And we don't pay them down very fast until we get relatively far into the system. Because we're going to have to foreclose on lots of people. This is the unpleasant part. And then there will be growth. But it'll take until 2023 before we go back to the old equilibrium if we continue to grow at 2.5% on a regular basis, which is the long-term trend and which I do believe we can do. But what I want to emphasize is this is not a crisis that will be over in a few months. Okay? Just simply think about it this way. Unemployment rate's about 10%. But a lot of people are finding new jobs, and a lot of other people are losing jobs. It's losing jobs that causes people to lose their homes. Next year, another 5% of the world labor force is going to lose their jobs. I know it's terrible to say that. And a lot of these people will lose their homes. There will be more foreclosures. Okay? And that's going to continue for a couple more years. Unless we could massively and instantaneously find a way to bring unemployment down to 4%, and I don't think we can, at least not as an economist. So some of you may, after all these experiences, have decided that financial markets is something we should be worried about. I should not move us to think badly about financial markets or even about adjustable rate subprime mortgages. I think it'd be an interesting question to design how we could actually get away with this. It's just a question of making them expensive enough to banks so that they don't offer too many. Because nearly all the large-scale challenges we face, whether you think it's about the environment, whether it's think about aging, whether it's about health, whether you think about it's repairing our infrastructure, are going to work, are going to be easier to meet if we have well-functioning financial markets. So our decision is not whether we have them or not, or whether who we should punish, but what kinds of financial markets we need and what kind of financial markets we want. Now, in 2005, we published a book in which we decided that it wasn't interesting enough to talk about the coming mortgage crisis. So the conclusion is about the looming crisis associated with the looming retirement of the baby boom. But if you're interested in more of these issues of the relationship between financial markets and history, I suggest you can find it, as one of my co-authors says, in any good bookstore, which means almost none. And on that note, I want to thank you. I will stick around here to take your questions right at the bottom of the podium. In closing, I want to thank Phil Hoffman, who's a professor at Caltech here, with whom I have worked now for more than 25 years. I also want to thank Lance Davis, who got me working on financial markets, and then in particular the political economists who taught me that institutions are as much a problem about economics, but they're even more so a problem of politics. And I think that's what we do at Caltech that makes us different. And thank you. Good night.
This program is brought to you by Caltech. Visit us at caltech.edu.